Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Edda Fields-Black, the author of Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. She's a professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University and is, as of early May, a Pulitzer Prize winner. So it is our honor that Dr. Edda Fields-Black has agreed to share her work on our show. Professor, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. I normally start with a vignette and then a question that introduces the idea of the book. But in this case, I just want to ask about what happened to you just a few weeks ago. We all know the quote, I'd rather have the Pulitzer than the presidency. You now have one of them. I am resisting the urge to ask you how it felt to win because I assume that's relatively obvious. But I do want to ask you, Doctor, how much did it matter to you before you won this award to have your work recognized in this way? And did that change after you were awarded the Pulitzer Prize?
I have to admit that I wanted the Pulitzer Prize. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say, oh, it didn't matter. And
No
oh,
big deal.
no, that was my goal. Um,
Was it
my
lifelong?
editor had won it for a book that my editor edited, won it in 2020. And this was just as I was signing my advance contract, just after. So it got me to thinking that this was actually a goal that I could attain. And I'm not saying that I woke up and thought about it every day. I did not. I'm not saying that as I was in the weeds of writing and simultaneously researching Combee that it was, on my vision board or something. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that yes, I wanted it, and I was so happy and just absolutely elated when the announcement came.
Did it change? Did anything change after you won it? Did it meet the moment that you were expecting?
Yes and no. I don't know what I was expecting. What I was expecting and hoping for wasn't concrete, right? It was just this idea of the Pulitzer. And I have to say that even now, it's still not concrete.
Mhm.
What makes it concrete is that my email, my cell phone, my telephone half the time just constantly vibrate, and I can't keep up with any of them. That is concrete.
Well, I was one of the people who I had never heard of the book until you won. So I guess I was one of the people who contributed to all that, and we're thankful you agreed to be here. So your book begins with the heat of the moment in the foreword, June 20th, 1863. Soldiers crashing slave pens along the Combahee River in South Carolina, which is, of course, the first state to secede in the name of protecting slavery. Hundreds of people were running for their lives and for freedom. Even Harriet Tubman, as you recount in that opening chapter, was stunned. So, did you try to keep emotional distance from that scene as like a reporter would in order to capture it accurately? Or did you feel that the only way to capture that scene accurately was to be emotional as you were writing?
Yeah, I throughout Cumbie, I was emotional. That was one of my goals as well. And I wanted people to feel this history. I wanted them to really try to fathom what the freedom seekers were going through. So I one of my objectives was really to put the audience in the rice fields with the freedom seekers, for them to run from the rice fields to the boats. with the freedom seekers, with Harriet Tubman, and then to provide the backstory, right, of why that was such a moment of freedom. These rice plantations were incredibly deadly. Their lives were just awful in ways that we can't imagine. And many, many people, particularly children, died. So I wanted readers to try to empathize with that. Um, and historians, like journalists, are taught to be objective, and that's a word that I've rejected for
We
the
went round
past
and
10
round on that
years.
word in journalism school. So,
Yeah, well, in graduate school, we were just told not to do it, right?
mm,
So I'm breaking all the rules. But the fact of the matter is, I'm writing about my family, right? Even though my named ancestors have a very small role in the book, uh, finding my family history has a large role in the project. And I wanted people to think about their own family members as they read this story.
and we're going to get into some more of that as we go on, but I want to ask just about the raid itself. Highly coordinated, as is evident by the rowboats that the Union troops had along the riverbanks to literally shuttle freed men and women to larger and children to larger ships. How
Hmm.
much does that coordination in the rescue plan reveal about how closely guarded and contrived this system was made, over several centuries to keep these people in
Hmm.
bondage?
I think that what you see is this was a system, right? It was a social, political, cultural system. The rice plantations were a little bit different in the sense that white people lived on the rice plantations for just a fraction of the year. And so this system of terror was implemented to keep Black people working, to continue to exploit their labor, even when whites were not there, even when there were no overseers there. And so the Union kind of matches that with its own very coordinated system to get people out, to get them off of the plantations, off of the river, and even one plantation that's more distant from the river, right? To send these rowboats to the more distant plantations, to take people to the transport steamers, and it's the transport steamer that brings them to Beaufort.
I'm not a military buff. It's sort of one of the weak points of my historical understanding. The movements of troops and which battle came when are just not what I am interested in. But the Civil War obviously is this spider web of geography and battles won and lost, and which side was up and which side was down, and of turning points. The raid happens just 2 weeks from the Battle of Gettysburg.
Hmm.
A lot of people say that that is the war's turning point. If you can just describe where the war was at this point, could either side sense that it was about to turn?
No, no. The Union was down, and the Department of the South, particularly, and South Carolina was part of the Department of the South, had been very quiet. You know, there had been very little going on. There were criticisms of General David Hunter. It's like, what is he doing? What's going on? Nobody, there's no action, right? He's all talk, he's no action. And morale was low. You know, morale was low, and the Union was beginning. The Combee raid is sort of one of the first little pot shots that the Union takes at Charleston. It's like this is the first time that they're really back in South Carolina and trying to make an advance toward this larger goal. And it was a small shot in the larger picture of retaking those South Carolina ports, those Charleston ports. But for morale, it was huge.
And the attraction is, if we can make this happen, the morale starts to shift, and then word of
Mhm.
this raid begins to spread and say, hey, we can do this.
Well, I think that was a long goal. I think that was let's retake Charleston where the Civil War started. I think the short objective of the raid was to fill the regiment, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, to recruit soldiers for that regiment to take out this pontoon bridge that was on the Combee River, was at Combee Ferry, to stop the Confederacy from illegally trafficking in rice that it was using to feed the troops and feed civilians, despite the U.S. Navy blockade. And if you want to think about morale on the other side, to make the enemy pay the way, right? To get Confederate citizens, private citizens, to feel the impact of this war because they were supporting the military. The military couldn't make the advances it had made without the support of the Confederate citizens. And so if we start, and speaking like Colonel James Montgomery here, if we start burning and destroying the property of Confederate citizens, they're going to start to get it, right? They're going to start to get it. And this is, years before Journal General William Tecumseh Sherman's scorched earth policy, right? So this is one of the first acts of scorched earth on the Combahee River.
The biggest name on the cover of your book, well, the only name on the cover of your book, but one of the biggest names in American history is Harriet Tubman. Explain just who she was. I mean, there's sort of this legend, but she was a real person. How did she get connected to military commanders?
Yes, Tubman is such an extraordinary figure. Most of us know her as the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. She's born on the Maryland Eastern Shore in 1822, sorry. She's born in bondage, and she liberated herself in 1849. And then she did, something that was absolutely extraordinary. She went back,
Right,
right? She
right.
went back 13 times to rescue other people, family members, friends, community members, people who were in bondage in the same neighborhood, in the same area where she had grown up. She goes back 13 times and brings approximately 70 people out of bondage. And I liken it to putting your hand all the way in the alligator's mouth and bringing it out, right? All the way in and bring it
And
out
13 times.
13
Right.
times
Yeah.
and not get
I'll
bitten.
pass. Right,
Me
right,
too.
right.
I would
Yeah.
pass on the first time.
Right, right, right.
So, and then she gives specific instructions to more people, and about 70 of them liberate themselves. So these were just absolutely selfless and superhuman acts. She became a part of, after she liberates herself and as she's going back to Eastern Maryland, she became a part of networks of abolitionists in Massachusetts, Philadelphia, upstate New York. And she meets John Brown through these abolitionist networks and becomes very close to John Brown as he's planning his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Um, and John Brown gives her the name General Tubman. Ultimately, she does not participate with John Brown. And there are a number of people like Frederick Douglass who were sort of with him in the planning, but when the raid actually happened, they were not there. And we're not 100% sure why Tubman wasn't there. She may have been ill, and she had these periodic bouts of illness. Um, but that experience and John Brown's vision and passion to take up arms against slavery is something that had a tremendous impact on her. So after this big battle in Beaufort, the Battle of Port Royal in November of 1861, Tubman comes down in May of 1862 to South Carolina. The arrangements for her to come down are made by the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, and she comes down to be a spy and a scout for the U.S. Army Department of the South. And it's an extraordinary thing again because this time she doesn't know, these folks, these formerly enslaved people. She has not much in common with them. They don't even really speak the same dialect. Culturally, there are significant differences. And yet she comes down into the belly of the beast, which is South Carolina, to risk her life for freedom.
And this had, as you say in the book, this is a part of her life that has been very rarely studied by people. It's incredible to still be finding things 150, 160 years later.
Yes, and when I started thinking about whether or not I was going to write the book, I thought, don't we know everything about Harriet Tubman's life? How can I'm not a Tubman biographer, what makes me think I'm going to be able to turn over something new?
That was a
You
goal
know,
to, I've got to find something new, tangible.
that became a goal. Yes, as you see, the goals were many. But I was hoping I wanted to be able to tell a new story, tell it in a new way, and provide some take on Tubman's life that was new and fresh.
And one thing that strikes me is that she sort of, even though she can barely read or maybe not read at all, she has a political sensibility. She sort of understands that the Fugitive Slave Act, I guess 10 years, 11 years before the war starts, she understands that that's going to be a catalyst for
Hmm.
this collision.
Hmm.
What gave her that political sensibility despite the lack of, and this is a very, I guess, obvious, but also a loose statement that she had no classical training in politics.
No, no, she didn't. And she was completely illiterate. Tubman could read people, she could read the environment. She was someone who had sort of these soft skills, if you
Mhm.
will, where she could, even though she could not read or write, she could understand things very well. And she was well connected with abolitionists from the time that she liberates herself. So she's enmeshed in this community and she's part of this effort to organize for the immediate abolition of slaves. So emancipation of slaves. So as part of that movement, she got to know the issues very, very well and became a key player in this advocacy. And people, she was advised to leave after the 1850 Act went into effect. And this is when she goes to Canada for a while, but then she comes back. Right? She comes back and she's right back in Maryland, rescuing freedom seekers, the
Yeah,
Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
unbelievable. The other star of your book is Colonel James Montgomery. Just describe who he is, and then, of course, the differences that are apparent when it comes to this military leader.
Yeah, Colonel James Montgomery was a military leader from Kansas. So he was part of Bleeding Kansas and actually took up arms. He's one of John Brown's men, in quotes, and took up arms in Kansas during this time of Bleeding Kansas when uh, Southern states are trying to expand slavery
And he's white. I mean, we should say that, right? Yeah.
He is white.
Yeah.
Yes, he is white. So he was a bit of a firebrand, if you will,
Mm,
and he was part of this network with David Hunter, who was the general. The difference being that many of the people in the network were all talk. Montgomery had actually led his Jayhawkers. He had, boots on the ground in Kansas going to war to stop the expansion of slavery. So Montgomery comes down to South Carolina and becomes the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, which is the 2nd Black Regiment in South Carolina. He was the commander of the raid, and when General Hunter asked Tubman if she would go on the raid, she said she would if Montgomery was the commander. So she had a lot of respect for him, and he had a lot of respect for her. And he's an interesting figure because he was very sort of millenarian, right? Just a very interesting view of Christianity. And did much of his, military exploits in the name of Christianity. Um, he insisted that all of his soldiers got married, they were had Bible study, every day. That he was very strict in camp. Um, but when it came to Confederate planters, it's like he was on a holy war against the Confederacy,
mm,
one planter at a time. And he wanted, and this was his phrasing, to make the enemy pay the way.
mm.
So I'm going to take the war off of the battlefield and I'm going to take it to the Confederate planters, and we're going to see how long the war is going to last.
Interesting. I want to go into your sources a little bit here before we get to the raid itself. Couple of questions. One is your initial note on the names, um,
Mm,
how, the names you have to sort of piece them together, and you can only rely on certain documents, and how accurate are they going to be? Um, Describe slave life in these particular areas, and to me, it's very revealing that the names are so hard to pin down.
yeah. So the rice plantations were the environment in which they are situated is incredibly deadly. Um, because rice grows in standing water, the water breeds mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes carried malaria. So the enslaved people who were forced to labor in these rice fields had chronic malaria for all of their lives. Um, the majority of children died before their first birthdays. Of those that survived, about 60% died before their 15th birthdays. And those who survived into adulthood, again, with chronic malaria, um, women gave birth to babies that were unable to thrive. And this is why they're dying, before
I mean,
year one.
this is akin to being born in a war zone.
This is akin to being born in a war zone. These were the second highest death rates. Only sugar plantations in the Caribbean had higher death rates. And for adults that looked healthy, right, and were in the prime of their lives, their immune systems were totally shattered with this chronic malaria. And so respiratory disease would just kill them like that. Um, these are places you have to think about the rice fields as being infested with alligators. Hence my analogy of putting your hand in the
Mm.
alligator's mouth. And so people are standing, and at the time that the raid takes place at when the boats first come up the Combee, it's 4 a.m. They're standing in the rice field that are infested with alligators, and they can't see their hands in front of their faces. Parents would be separated from their children once the children were old enough to work. So we're talking maybe 9 or 10 years old. And the mothers would be in one field together, and the children would be in an adjacent field. In the dark, the fields are infested with alligators and they can't see their children. Okay. So the terror of living and being forced to live and forced to work in this environment was very, 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 very real. Um,
And the names are hard to pin down just because the documentation wasn't obviously wasn't careful.
well, throughout, if you look at plantation documents in general, this is writ large. The rule is that enslaved people are only recorded by first names. You will come across an exceptional case every now and again, and it's a house servant, it's a house slave, who is given a last name that's typically the last name of the enslaver. Um, and the thinking is that, you know, that's all they had, right? Enslaved people didn't have last names. And what I'm showing in Combee is that they actually did. They had them within the enslaved community, even though they were not recognized by the slaveholder. So it makes it this state of affairs of people only being listed by first names makes it incredibly hard to identify individual people and to know that this person enslaved on a particular plantation who's listed in this plantation journal is the same person who is then freed and is in the 1870 census. It's impossible when all you have are first names.
Yep. I mean, paperwork is hard enough to come by when it comes to studying slave plantations. We've heard that from a number of authors who have been on this show. It's made even more difficult for you, unfortunately, because many of the papers were burned in the raid
Exactly.
itself.
Exactly.
Um,
And
where
I will add that the raid took place in Beaufort and Colleton counties, and the county records for both counties were burned by General Sherman.
so you lost even more there.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
We
another tough one for you.
we thought we had lost even more there, but because the Combee planters only spent a few months per year on these plantations, they actually filed the deeds and the slave transactions in Charleston, and Charleston was not burned.
Okay. Uh, when it comes to Harriet Tubman, where are the most useful sources and papers? Are they kept in a place that's relatively easily accessible?
Those were relatively accessible. Tubman's story hadn't been told because she's not mentioned in the official military record, but there were many abolitionists from the North who came down after the Battle of Port Royal, and they volunteered as teachers and missionaries and labor managers. They were people with whom Tubman was organizing in the 1850s. They wrote letters home describing her activities in Beaufort.
Did you, as you were setting out to write this and coming up with this project in your head, did you plan on narrative nonfiction?
Yes, that was another goal, and it took me a long time to figure out what story I wanted to tell. I think it took me just as long to figure out that I was going to tell a story because that's not what academic historians are trained to do in
Yeah, I mean that's
graduate
why I
school.
asked. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I had to throw off a lot of baggage. And I had to learn a lot of new skills. You know, I had to, okay, this is the goal. Great. Now, how do you do it? Right? Because this is not what I'm trained to do. How do you do it? How do you tell a story? And so that was a process.
How did your other books on rice, particularly on rice, lead you here? Is there sort of a doorway that you walk through as you were doing those studies that sort of led you naturally to this particular story?
I would say yes. I like to say that I was minding my own business in the Ace Basin of South Carolina in my rice fields when I encountered Harriet Tubman. So I come to the Combee River Raid through rice, right? It was my work on rice in West Africa as well as in the South Carolina Low Country that really just enlivened this story for me. And very little had been written about the Combee raid. What had been written, I thought, what was one of the big things that was missing is that it took place on 7 rice plantations. The other piece is that another goal became telling the story of the raid through the words and in the perspectives of the people Tubman freed. And so I have this other part of my work, my previous work, where I specialize in finding new sources, and sometimes they're interdisciplinary sources, to tell the stories of people in West Africa and people in the African diaspora who did not leave written sources. Tubman is illiterate. The enslaved people are largely illiterate, right? The people who were freed in the raid. So I had to find new sources in order to tell their stories. And that's also become a specialty throughout my career.
It's so interesting. We hear so much about cotton growing up, at least, as an amateur historian for myself and reading all these books. It's cotton, cotton, cotton all the time. And perhaps rightfully so. Why do you think rice is often left out of the sort of mainstream narrative around slavery?
I don't know. Maybe it's because cotton is king and the geographical region in which cotton was grown is so large. But it does dominate, if you will, the US, the American imagination. If we think about slavery in the US, we're thinking about cotton. If we think about slavery in the Caribbean, we're thinking about sugar. So rice doesn't play a role at all. And rice was grown in a relatively small region, mainly South Carolina and Georgia, but a little bit in North Carolina, a little bit in Florida. And I think it can't hold a candle to King
Hmm.
Cotton.
Um, I want to ask about the night of the raid. Let's get back to the sort of plot here. What happens the night of the raid? How do the Union troops organize themselves? And um, how much does the reality of what they found on the ground match what they had expected to find?
Well, I'll start with by saying that it's pretty clear from my research that the Union had been on the Combahee River before the raid. There had been a number of reconnaissance missions on the river before the raid. There were freedom seekers brought down uh, by a General Stevens, who we think is, I always forget his first name, Ingalls Stevens. It'll come back to me. From the Combee before the raid, there were people who were in bondage on these 7 plantations who escaped before the raid. We know that Harriet Tubman infiltrated the Combee plantations before the raid, and she and her group of spies, scouts, and pilots, these were men whom she recruited, trained, and commanded, um, helped to defuse the mines, the torpedoes, they're called in the literature, that the Confederacy used to mine the Combee River. So the Union knew that the river was now open. They knew that there were still people enslaved on these Combee plantations. And they had a sense, I would think, of how to get in and how to get out. And it was really, okay. I'm getting excited. So the boats left at 9 p.m. from the wharf in downtown Beaufort.
And they want the darkness,
They
obviously, right?
they
Yeah.
want the darkness. They want the element of surprise. And they may have known that the Confederacy had reassigned the troops that were stationed on the river because the raid takes place in June, and June is during the so-called sickly season, right? And so most of the time before the raid, white people left because they would die of malaria. It made black people extremely sick, but white people would die of malaria. So they may have known that there were no Confederate troops on the river. So they leave downtown Beaufort about 9 p.m. on June 1st in three Union boats, one gunboat and two transport steamers, and they go north through the Beaufort River. They get to the mouth of the Coosaw River and they run aground. And Harriet Tubman's men were piloting these ships up the river, these boats, I'm sorry, they're boats up the river. And one of them, Isaac Hayward, likely made the call that they take the shortcut and go through the Beaufort to the mouth of the Coosaw, as opposed to going all the way around through Port Royal Sound. Now, they needed the darkness. That was their advantage. The element of surprise was their advantage also. It was risky, right? It was very risky because the Coosaw River is notorious for its sandbars. Yet they took the risk so that they could preserve the element of surprise and they could get up to the mouth of the Combee, get up to on the Combee plantations in the dark. So two boats continue, one transport steamer and the gunboat, and then they hit the mouth of the Combee at Fields Point and first encounter Confederate pickets. These are guards, and their guards' goal, their job was to assess the situation and call for reinforcements. They encounter the black soldiers of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, black men in uniform, and they flee. And they're wonderful accounts of them fleeing so quickly that they leave their blankets behind, right? So, and they go off and they call for reinforcements. These are the first boots that are on the ground, 2nd South Carolina soldiers, two companies left at Fields Point. They continue to Tar Bluff, and then they hit the Combee plantations. So the first stop is at Longbrow Plantation. And we have an account from the planter of Longbrow about what he experienced that morning. We also know that as they made the next two stops, Longbrow and Combee Ferry, um, Colonel Montgomery sent rowboats out. So a rowboat was sent out to James L. Paul's plantation just south of Longbrow and picked up freedom seekers, one of whom is Minus Hamilton. And Minus Hamilton is one of the stars of Combee, I like to say. An 88-year-old man who told his story of what happened to he and his wife during the Combee River raid. We know from Minus Hamilton that it was 4 a.m. when the gunboats arrived and that the enslaved people were already in the rice fields hoeing rice. So another two companies from the 2nd South Carolina are disembarked in at Longbrow. The rowboats are sent out. The transport steamer remains there, docked. The gunboat continues up the river. Harriet Tubman, her group of spy scouts and pilots, more companies of the 2nd South Carolina, and then the one battery of 3rd Rhode Island heavy artillery are on the gunboat. And they get up to Combee Ferry, which is where the raid ends. And this was the location of the pontoon bridge. Rowboats are sent out again. We know that Tubman was on one of those rowboats. We know that she participates in burning buildings and that she actually went to the slave cabins and coaxed people who were left in the slave cabins to come on to freedom. Um, the 2nd South Carolina in total burned 7 rice plantations to the ground. And as I say that, people have to imagine multiple buildings on a very large, couple hundred, if not 1,000 acres of land. The planter's house, the mansion house, The barns, the stables, all of that is burned. There was the previous year's rice harvest in the barn. Then they went to the rice fields and they opened the irrigation gates and they let the salt water in and they killed the crop that was growing in the fields at the time. Um, the third Rhode Island heavy artillery burned and took up the pontoon bridge, which was a wooden bridge. And this cuts the supply line so that the Confederacy makes it more difficult for them to continue exporting rice, right? Um, and 756 people were freed in 6 hours.
And so these folks are either in slave cabins or in slave pens, and they realize what's happening and they just make a run for it.
Well, a good number of them were already in the rice fields,
Okay, right.
and on most of the Combee plantations, the rice fields are adjacent to the river, right? There's an embankment that holds the Combee River back from the rice fields, and the river is actually used to irrigate the rice fields. What happened though is that there are only two boats. So people had to run from where they were to get to the boat, right? There were also people who were at the main house. These would have been house slaves. There were people who were still in the slave quarters. They would have been elderly people, disabled people, people who were ill and too sick to work. Um, and so those are the people who are still in the slave quarters, which are on most of the plantations about a mile away from the rice fields. So those folks are running to the rice fields, and then everyone is running down to the boats.
And then what is the reaction? What is the response? When do the Confederate, well, not even Confederate, but the slave owners themselves start to realize, we're under attack and we're not only losing our crops, but we're losing our most valuable asset?
Interestingly enough, there were two planters and one overseer on the plantations when the raid took place. And this is totally an anomaly, right? That you have white people sleeping on rice plantations in June. But they chose to be there after the Battle of Port Royal and after the Confederate Army told them to evacuate. We cannot protect you, because they wanted to try to keep exploiting enslaved people's labor to grow rice. It was that profitable that they're risking their lives. So those planters knew immediately what was going on. The problem was there were no soldiers on the river, right? They had to wait for reinforcements to come from 15 miles away. Those was the closest reinforcements. And that took time. And so you had two planters, one at Longbrow and one at Cypress, who both wrote about their experiences in the moment of what happened to them. The one at Longbrow said the enslaved driver, long story, the enslaved driver basically barged into his bedroom at 5 a.m. and said, "The Union is here. They are coming up to the front door right now." So the boat is coming up to park at his boat landing, which would have been his front door. And he tells the driver to go get the field hands who are already in the rice fields. He's going to get the house servants, the house slaves, meet up in the woods and hide. And as you can imagine, he gets to the house. The Bond's people are packing whatever they can pack.
Hmm.
And they're telling him, yes, we're going to follow you. And then they go the other way.
So is it possible to determine whether to discern whether this event has an impact on the larger war? And does word of this reach Abraham Lincoln?
Word of it definitely reaches Abraham Lincoln. General Hunter writes to Lincoln, and Lincoln commends Colonel Montgomery. Does it impact the wider war? I would think it does. I would think it does. And, I think there's a ripple effect. You have 150 Combee men who join the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers the next morning. Those men go on to fight with the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers in all of their engagements. You have Colonel James Montgomery's scorched earth policy, for which he was then criticized, not on the Combee, but in Darien, Georgia, right? These are all precursors of William Tecumseh Sherman's scorched earth policy. By the time Sherman does it, by that moment in the war, there's no criticism, right? This is something that also turns the tide and helps bring the war to a conclusion. We can trace that back to the Combee Raid.
Mm.
And I would also say that the 756 people who liberate themselves, they are the largest, it's the largest slave rebellion, I argue, in U.S. history happened in this raid. Um, those 756 people are a drop in the ocean of 500,000 formerly enslaved people who voted with their feet. They risked everything to get behind U.S. lines seeking protection during the war. And ultimately, it's their actions that lead to the destruction of slavery.
Your own family was found in these pension files. Um, just describe the emotions for instance, my history goes back to 1909 in this country. I'm white. I just don't have that emotional feeling in the same way that a descendant would. Just describe it if you can, finding these names in there.
Yeah. So my father was born a mile or two from where the raid took place. We knew the name of Hector Fields, who was my great 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 grandfather, and his direct line down to my great grandfather and grandfather. We didn't know anything else. And as I started to research Combee, um, I found Hector's pension file, which I found that out that Hector was a veteran of the 2nd South Carolina, which we did not know. People think I wrote Combee because of Hector, and that's nothing could be further from the truth. This was a pleasant surprise. His pension file really had very little information. He didn't get a pension. But then, and I was working with the International African American Museum Center for Family History, and I was trying to research the Fields family. And this was a separate project, I thought. They helped me to find Jonas Fields' pension file, who was Hector's brother. And in that file, we learned the names of Hector's siblings and their parents. So these are my great, 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 great grandparents, which is so unusual for an African American family to be able to go back that far. Um, where they were in bondage in downtown Beaufort and who held them in bondage, how they got separated before the war. The everybody but Hector were house slaves. My aunt was given away as a wedding gift. And then they get separated during the war when Jonas's the slaveholder sends the men to one state, the women to another state after the Battle of Port Royal. Jonas is separated from his wife. The wife becomes mentally ill and they never live together again. It was extremely emotional to learn this history about my family. On the one hand, to actually know was a gift. On the other hand, then you have to deal with what you know. And writing Combee in general was extremely emotional. And what I did was to just try to channel that emotion into the writing, into the work. so that the readers could understand the pain and the power of this history.
Much to my sadness, we only have a couple of minutes left with you. I want to just ask if there's a takeaway that you want people who read this book or listen to this podcast to have for those of us living here in the year 2025. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's all that stuff about your family history. But is there more? What would be the takeaway?
I think the takeaway is that Harriet Tubman, her group of spies, scouts, and pilots, the Second South Carolina Volunteers, and really all of the almost 200,000 men who fought in the U.S. colored troops and the women who were with them, they risked their lives for freedom. You know, they sacrificed potentially their own freedom for the freedom of others. They built coalitions. They, you know, got out of their comfort zones and they put it all on the line. And I think that says a lot to us today. I think that sometimes I think we've got to learn that what I'm not free. My group, however I define myself, is not free until everyone is free, right? And so I may have to sacrifice. I may have to cross the aisle. I may have to get out of my comfort zone and create coalitions with people who don't look like me so that we can all be free and we can sustain our freedom.
I'm just sitting here thinking maybe freedom is relatively rare.
Mm. I think it can be fleeting, right? It can be fleeting. And I do think it's relatively rare because we just have examples of how it can be turned back.
Uh, your dedication is to three people.
Yes,
Anna Fraser, Kate, I hope I say it right, Katie Gillillard, and
Gilliard.
Gilliard, and Jonas Fields. You say
Yes.
Jonas Fields kept you linked to your ancestral home, that he shared with you what he knew of your family's stories and inspired you in generations to come. Why did you want to make sure you left that note in there for those three people?
Ah. As a child, they kept us. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and we went back every summer to visit my great grandmother, who was Anna Richards Fraser. So as a child, these three people they introduced me to my family in South Carolina. As an adult, they really just gave me the family that I didn't know about in South Carolina. And kept me linked, kept me grounded, kept me coming back and learning more in so many ways. And those early memories, early childhood memories, um, certainly influenced the research I do. And that research, of course, led to Combee.
Are you taking a break, or do you have an idea of what you're going to do next? And don't let me
Well,
ask. I don't want to give out homework assignments here. I'm just
yes,
asking.
yes. Well, right now, Combee is still occupying my time. I'm still on the road with Combee. I've collaborated with an artist whose photographs are in Combee. This is J. Henry Fair, the environmental and conservation photographer, and a curator, Dr. Vanessa Thaxton Ward from the Hampton Museum. So we have an art exhibit at the Gibbs Museum of Art that's based on Combee and features Henry's photographs of the environment and the Combee plantations, the Combee River, as well as some masterpieces by African American artists. So that's what I'm working on now, in addition to being on book tour with Combee. Um, I have a public history project next, and that is collaborating with information scientists at Carnegie Mellon to crowdsource transcriptions of the pension files and then use AI so that historians, genealogists, and family members can identify and tell the stories of individual enslaved people.
Now, there's a use for AI that I find attractive.
We're trying to do something good with AI. Yes. Wish us luck.
Dr. Edda Fields-Black, the author of Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. Thank you so much for being here. It's really our honor to have you.
Thank you.
Check
Thank you.
out
It's
the
a
book.
pleasure.
Check out the book and also her website, eddafieldsblack.com. She's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Edda Fields-Black. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.